Hey guys, tonight we begin with an invitation. An invitation to a wedding. But forget everything you think you know about romantic proposals, choosing your own partner, or even a private, dignified ceremony. You are being summoned to a medieval marriage, and what awaits you is less a celebration of love and more a terrifying plunge into a world of brutal bargains, public humiliation, and a statistical likelihood of an early, agonizing death. You're getting married tomorrow, perhaps, but instead of butterflies in your stomach, there's a cold, hard knot of dread. You didn't choose your partner. Your parents, driven by social pressure or cold, hard economics, likely sold you off, perhaps as young as 6 or 12, to secure a business deal, an alliance, or simply to be rid of a financial burden. Your wedding night. Prepare for it to be a public spectacle where guests, your family, even priests might literally watch you get into bed with a virtual stranger. And if, by some miracle, you survive the traumatic, almost guaranteed to be horrific childbirths that will inevitably follow, congratulations. You've now got maybe a 50-50 chance your new spouse won't quite legally beat you, imprison you, or find some other inventive, lawful way to make your life a living hell, or even end it. Welcome, my friends, to the grim reality of medieval marriage, a world where the vow, "till death do us part," was less a romantic promise and more a chillingly realistic and often brutally short timeline. You think your modern dating life is rough? Try navigating an era where your father could literally sell you to the highest bidder before you'd even learned to walk properly, where your wedding night came with an eager, intrusive audience, where every pregnancy was a game of Russian roulette played with your life, and divorce was about as achievable and as socially acceptable as deciding to sprout wings and fly to the moon. This is not the stuff of fairy tales, unless those fairy tales were written by the Brothers Grimm in one of their particularly bleak moods. The reality check for tonight? By the time we're done unraveling the twisted tapestry of medieval matrimony, you'll be fervently thanking every modern convenience, every legal right, every ounce of personal autonomy you possess. Because compared to what our ancestors, particularly our female ancestors, endured in the name of holy matrimony, even your worst modern breakup will look like a blissfully happy ending. The secretly worse aspect of it all, as our title suggests, is how deeply entrenched, how legally sanctioned, and how utterly inescapable these horrors often were. So before you get too comfortable in your 21st century assumptions about love and marriage, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, these deep, often disturbing dives into the parts of history that don't make it into the sanitized textbooks. And please do let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see our global community of history explorers gathering for these nightly journeys. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum that helps to blur the edges of the present. And let's ease into tonight's rather unsettling journey together. We are about to step into the medieval marriage nightmare, a world of child brides, public beddings, life-threatening childbirths, legalized spousal abuse, and crushing economic pressures. Prepare to understand why, for so many in the Middle Ages, marriage was not a path to happiness but a brutal, lifelong contract of survival, or often a tragically short one. This is the boring history to sleep that will make modern dating, with all its foibles, look like an absolute paradise. Your journey into the medieval marriage nightmare often begins before you can even comprehend the words, "I do," perhaps even before you can string together a coherent sentence about your favorite wooden toy. You are a child, especially if you are a girl born into a family of any standing, from minor gentry to high nobility, and your shocking secret is that your value is being calculated, your future bartered on a ruthless marriage market almost from the moment you leave the cradle. This isn't about finding a soulmate. It's about sealing alliances, consolidating estates, and ensuring the transfer of wealth and power. You are, in essence, a commodity, sold to the highest or most politically advantageous bidder. Imagine the scene, as vividly painted in the script notes you provided earlier, turn 267, through the story of Lady Margaret Beaufort. She would one day become the mother of King Henry VII, the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty, a woman of immense political acumen and power in her own right. But her journey began in the brutal marketplace of high-stakes medieval marriage. At the tender age of just 6, her guardians married her off, or rather contracted her marriage, to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. You, as Margaret, wouldn't even be consulted. A 6-year-old girl still learning her letters, perhaps, her world one of play and nursery rhymes, is suddenly the centerpiece of a complex real estate transaction, a human seal on a dynastic agreement. Your script notes poignantly state, Margaret never even recognized this marriage. She was literally too young to understand what was happening to her. She might be dressed in fine clothes for a ceremony she doesn't comprehend, her small hand placed in that of a boy or man she has never met, while solemn vows are spoken over her uncomprehending head. The medical hardship here is not physical illness, but the profound psychological disorientation, the theft of childhood. One quirky, or rather chilling detail is that such child betrothals or marriages were often legally binding, at least in principle, though they might not be consummated for many years. The adults around Margaret, however, knew exactly what they were doing, securing control of her massive inheritance. She was an heiress, and her lands and titles were the true prize, and this was not a one-time event for Margaret. Just 3 years later, when she is 9, the political winds shift. Her first marriage to John de la Pole is dissolved as if it never happened, another legalistic maneuver by powerful men. And she is sold again, this time to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who was 24 years old. Margaret, at this point, is 12. The age gap is horrifying by our standards, but not entirely uncommon for the era's nobility. The human endurance of a child being passed from one political arrangement to another, her own feelings and desires utterly disregarded, is a stark testament to the brutal realities of her world. The scholarly debate often centers on the prevalence of such extremely young marriages. While canon law, church law, stipulated minimum ages for marriage, typically 12 for girls, 14 for boys, for the marriage to be considered valid and eventually consummated, these rules were often bent or ignored, especially when significant political or financial interests were at stake. Papal dispensations could be sought and obtained, particularly by the powerful. The gory history is that the system was designed to accommodate the needs of the elite, often at the direct expense of the children involved. The shocking secret for you, our medieval child, is that your childhood itself is the first thing to be sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. You are not being raised, you are being groomed for a transaction. The story of Margaret Beaufort, married off at 6 and again at 12, is a stark illustration of the medieval child marriage market among the high nobility. But her case, while shocking, was not unique. To further understand the secret horror of being a child bride, a political pawn whose life is dictated by treaties and alliances, you need only look at the even more extreme, and perhaps more tragic, example of Isabella of Valois, daughter of the King of France, who, as your script notes from turn 267 vividly detailed, became Queen of England at an age when most children are still learning to read their first words. Imagine the year 1396. You are Isabella, and as your script notes confirm, you are just 6 years and 5 days old when you are married by proxy and then in person to King Richard II of England. Richard, as we know, is 29, a mature man, a widower, and a king desperate to secure peace with France and a hefty dowry. Your marriage is the linchpin of this diplomatic maneuvering. The medical hardship is self-evident. A 6-year-old child is physically and emotionally entirely unprepared for any aspect of marriage, let alone marriage to a foreign king in a strange land. The details of your trousseau, the collection of goods and possessions you bring to the marriage, are poignantly revealing. As your script notes highlight, it literally included her dolls and miniature silver furniture for them. This quirky tidbit is heartbreaking in its implications. Here is a Queen of England, whose marriage is sealing a 28-year truce between two warring kingdoms, and she is still of an age to be playing with dolls. The contrast between the immense political weight placed upon your tiny shoulders and your actual childish innocence is almost unbearable to contemplate. You are a queen, yet you are still a baby, in a sense. The wedding contract itself acknowledged the profound absurdity of your age. It specifically stipulated, as your notes mention, that the marriage couldn't be consummated until her 12th birthday. This at least offered a small measure of protection, a legal deferment of the physical demands of marriage that a 12-year-old like Margaret Beaufort was not afforded with Edmund Tudor. Even by medieval standards, where betrothing young children was common, marrying and crowning a 6-year-old as queen and having her actually reside with her adult husband, however platonically, was acknowledged as extreme. The human endurance required of you to simply exist in this bizarre adult world, To perform the ceremonial duties expected of a queen while still clutching your dolls is a testament to a childhood stolen. The scholarly debate might consider Richard II's motivations and his treatment of you. Was the delayed consummation clause strictly adhered to out of genuine concern for your well-being, or was it simply a pragmatic recognition that attempting anything else would be a political and social impossibility, even for a king? Accounts do suggest, as we will explore later, that Richard treated you more as a daughter, but the shocking secret remains. You were nonetheless his wife, his queen, your life irrevocably bound to his, your childhood innocence sacrificed on the altar of international diplomacy. Your dolls and miniature silver furniture, carried in your royal baggage train to England, are the silent, tragic witnesses to a childhood sold at 6. A life whose primary purpose, from that moment on, was to serve the political needs of powerful men and warring kingdoms. You have now seen two stark examples of child marriage among the medieval elite. Margaret Beaufort, an English heiress bartered for land and power, and Isabella of Valois, a French princess, sold at 6 to secure peace and a royal dowry. As a modern observer, you recoil at the thought of such practices, the seeming cruelty and callousness of parents and guardians who would subject mere children to such fates. But to understand this secret horror fully, you must try for a moment to step into the medieval mindset to grasp the brutal logic that underpinned these arrangements. The shocking secret is that these parents weren't necessarily monsters, not in their own eyes at least. They were, as your script notes from turn 267 astutely observed, operating in a system where children, especially daughters, were economic assets. Imagine the world of the medieval nobility and royalty. Life is precarious. Wars are frequent. Plagues can decimate populations. The Black Death in the mid-14th century was still a terrifyingly recent memory for those in the late 14th, 15th centuries, and political fortunes can shift with bewildering speed. In such an environment, securing the future of your family line, your lands, your titles, your wealth, is the paramount concern. And children, particularly daughters, who could not inherit primary titles or estates in most systems but could bring alliances and dowries, were crucial pieces in this high-stakes game of dynastic survival and advancement. The human endurance here is that of an entire class desperately trying to maintain its position in a volatile world. A daughter with significant land, titles, or the potential for a large dowry was, as your script notes put it, basically a winning lottery ticket that needed to be cashed in before something went wrong. And things went wrong constantly. The death of a father could leave a young heiress vulnerable to predatory relatives or rival families eager to seize her inheritance through a forced marriage. A shift in political alliances could suddenly make a previously arranged betrothal undesirable or a new, more advantageous match imperative. Therefore, parents and guardians often felt an urgent need to play the marriage market like day traders, as your script vividly describes, marrying off their children, especially daughters, as young as possible to lock in alliances and secure wealth transfers. It was a form of risk management, however brutal it might seem to us. The medical hardship of high infant and child mortality also played a role. With so many children dying young, securing a betrothal or marriage for a surviving child, even at a very young age, might have been seen as a way to ensure the continuation of a lineage or the cementing of an alliance before that child, too, succumbed to illness. One quirky, or rather grim reality is that a child bride who died before consummation or even after might still have served her political purpose if the dowry had been paid or the treaty signed. The scholarly debate often considers the degree of agency, if any, these child brides possessed. Were they consulted at all? Were their feelings ever taken into account? The overwhelming evidence suggests, rarely, if ever, especially at such young ages, they were property, assets, tools of diplomacy. The gory history is the emotional and psychological cost to these children, a cost that was deemed acceptable, even necessary, by the adults who controlled their fates. This practice, as your script notes state, was completely legal and socially acceptable among the upper classes. The church, while having rules about minimum ages for consummation, often turned a blind eye or granted dispensations when powerful political interests were involved. Money talked louder than morality. So, for the Margaret Beauforts and Isabella Valois of the world, childhood effectively ended the moment someone in a position of power decided their inheritance, or their potential as an alliance broker, was worth more than their innocence or their right to a normal childhood. The shocking secret of this brutal logic is its pervasiveness, its cold rationality within the context of a ruthless, power-obsessed society. Your life, as a noble child in this era, is not your own to live. It is a resource to be strategically deployed by your family for their own survival and advancement. And this, as you will soon see, is just the beginning of your medieval marital ordeal. You have been sold at 6, or perhaps at the slightly more mature age of 12, like Margaret Beaufort. The political treaties have been signed, the dowries negotiated, the solemn, and for you, utterly bewildering marriage ceremony performed. You are now legally bound to a husband who is likely a stranger, and often a man old enough to be your father or even grandfather. But the secret horror of your medieval marriage is far from over. In fact, one of its most intrusive and, to our modern sensibilities, deeply humiliating rituals is about to begin. The bedding ceremony, a tradition so invasive it makes, as your script notes from Turn 267 so aptly put it, reality TV producers blush. Welcome to the wedding night horror show. Imagine the scene, the lavish wedding feast filled with rich foods, flowing wine, music, and boisterous celebration by the assembled nobles and guests finally winds down. But this is not the moment where you, the newlywed couple, are discreetly allowed to retire for a private evening. Oh no. Instead, you become the centerpiece of another, far more intimate and far more public ritual. Your friends, if you are old enough to have them in this new, strange court, your family members, those who accompanied you or your new in-laws, and basically, as your script notes suggest, anyone who felt like watching, would now escort you, the bride, and your new husband, the groom, to your marital bedchamber. This procession to the bedroom is not a quiet affair. It is often accompanied by ribald jokes, suggestive songs, and a general air of boisterous, intrusive anticipation from the wedding guests. The medical hardship here is the sheer psychological stress and embarrassment, particularly for a young, inexperienced, and likely terrified bride. You are being led, almost like a sacrificial offering, to a bed that is not a private sanctuary but a public stage for the consummation, or at least the symbolic beginning, of your marriage. The purpose of this public bedding, especially among royalty and high nobility, where the legitimacy of heirs and the validity of political alliances were paramount, was multifaceted. It was in part a symbolic affirmation of the marriage union, a public witnessing that the couple had indeed been brought together. It was also, in a cruder sense, a way to ensure that the marriage could be consummated, or at least that the couple was placed in a situation where it was expected to happen. As we will explore, the consummation itself was the legal linchpin of marital validity. One quirky detail, or rather, a deeply unsettling one for a child bride like Isabella of Valois, who was only 6, is that she too would have undergone this public bedding ritual, even if the actual consummation was legally deferred for years. Imagine a 6-year-old girl still clutching her dolls, being ceremoniously put to bed with her 29-year-old husband, surrounded by a crowd of expectant adult courtiers. The sheer terror and confusion for her is almost unimaginable. The human endurance of such a child, forced to participate in adult rituals she cannot possibly understand, is heartbreaking. The scholarly debate considers the variations and intensity of these bedding ceremonies across different social classes and regions. While the most elaborate and intrusive forms were typically reserved for royalty and high nobility due to the political stakes involved, some form of public seeing the couple to bed was common in many parts of medieval Europe, even among commoners, though perhaps with less formality and fewer witnesses. The gory history here is the systemic invasion of privacy, the societal endorsement of a ritual that, by modern standards, feels like a grotesque violation. This public bedding is the prelude to the even more fraught and often terrifying reality of the medieval wedding night itself, a night where your secret horror as a bride, especially a child bride, is about to be laid bare. The boisterous, intrusive procession of wedding guests has finally reached your marital bedchamber. You, our medieval bride, perhaps a bewildered child like Isabella of Valois, or a slightly older but no less apprehensive young woman like Margaret Beaufort, are now at the heart of the wedding night horror show. The shocking secret is the series of rituals that unfold, designed not for your comfort or privacy, but as a public affirmation of the marriage contract, often involving layers of symbolic and sometimes deeply humiliating actions, all performed under the watchful eyes of your friends and family. As your script notes from turn 267 so vividly describe, the process is highly gendered. First, the women of the wedding party, your new female relatives, your ladies-in-waiting, if you are of high status, and other female guests, take you, the bride, into the bedchamber. They perform the ritual of undressing the bride. Your elaborate wedding gown is removed, perhaps with much joking and commentary. They comb your hair, and then, dressed in a simple night shift, you are ceremoniously put into the marriage bed. All the while, they might be offering helpful advice, often crude and unsolicited, about your wifely duties and what you are to expect from your new husband. Imagine the medical hardship of this unwanted intimacy, this public handling and scrutiny of your body, especially if you are a terrified child. Meanwhile, in another room, the men of the party are doing much the same with the groom. He too is undressed, perhaps made the subject of ribald jokes, and then, often in a state of some inebriation from the wedding feast, he is escorted into the bedchamber where you await. He is made to get into bed beside you. The human endurance required of you to lie there, exposed and vulnerable, as your new husband, a stranger, joins you under the gaze of numerous onlookers, is a profound test of fortitude. And the rituals continue. A priest, as your script notes mention, would often enter the bedchamber at this point to bless the marriage bed, praying for fertility and legitimate heirs. This sacred blessing, juxtaposed with the often lewd and intrusive atmosphere created by the guests, is a quirky, almost surreal detail. Then comes the stocking throwing. Bridesmaids and groomsmen, perhaps seated on either side of the bed, would take turns throwing your and your husband's stockings over their shoulders towards you. A direct hit on the bride or groom by a stocking supposedly meant the thrower would be the next to marry. Think of it, as your script notes suggest, as medieval target practice with your underwear, a frivolous game played out around a terrified bride and a nervous, or perhaps eager, groom. But here is where it gets truly uncomfortable, the gory history of public intrusion reaching its zenith. In many cases, particularly among royalty and high nobility where the political stakes of the marriage and its consummation were enormous, witnesses would, as your script notes state, actually stick around to ensure the marriage was consummated. They wouldn't necessarily watch the act itself directly. Even medieval people had some boundaries, your script dryly observes. But they would wait outside the bed curtains or in an antechamber, expecting some form of evidence or confirmation that the deed was done. The case of Margaret of York's wedding to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, in 1468, a slight correction from 1469 in your script notes, but the point stands, was such a significant political union that this bedding ceremony became an elaborate, minutely chronicled public affair, the pressure for consummation immense. The scholarly debate continues on how literal this witnessing was and how often the most extreme forms occurred. But the underlying principle was clear. The consummation of the marriage was a public, legal, and political concern, not merely a private matter between husband and wife. For you, our child bride, even if the actual consummation was deferred due to your age, this public bedding ritual, these intrusive traditions, served as a constant, terrifying reminder that your childhood was officially over, your body now considered the property of your husband and, by extension, the state. This ritualized humiliation, this public stripping of privacy, is a core part of the secret horror of medieval marriage. You've endured the public spectacle of the bedding ceremony, the lewd jokes, the intrusive blessings, the flying stockings. You are now, our medieval bride, finally left alone, or at least with the curtains drawn, with your new husband, often a stranger, in the marital bed. But the shocking secret is that the horror show isn't necessarily over. The weight of expectation, particularly for consummation, hangs heavy in the air because in the brutal, pragmatic world of medieval law and society, the physical act of consummating the marriage was not merely a private matter of marital intimacy. It was a crucial legal and political necessity, the very act that transformed a betrothal or a ceremony into a binding, indissoluble union. Imagine the pressure, especially if you are a young bride, perhaps even a child like Isabella of Valois, though her consummation was contractually delayed, or a slightly older but still vulnerable teenager like Margaret Beaufort. Your entire value, the success of the political alliance your marriage represents, the legitimacy of any future heirs, and often the final payment of your dowry, all hinges on this one act. As your script notes from turn 267 starkly put it, no consummation meant no valid marriage, which meant no inheritance rights, no political alliances, and no legitimate children. It was the ultimate legal seal on the contract. This legal emphasis on consummation had profound implications. If a marriage could be proven not to have been consummated, it was one of the few grounds upon which an annulment, a declaration that the marriage was never valid in the first place, might be granted by the Church, which held absolute authority over marriage in medieval Christendom. You can imagine powerful families if a political alliance soured or a more advantageous match presented itself, desperately trying to prove non-consummation to dissolve an inconvenient marriage. Conversely, families eager to solidify a union would be equally desperate to ensure, and sometimes even publicly attest to, its consummation. The medical hardship here is the potential for deeply intrusive physical examinations of brides, or even grooms, if non-consummation was alleged, a humiliating public ordeal. One quirky, or rather, revealing detail is the various forms of proof of consummation that were sometimes sought or offered, especially in high-stakes royal or noble marriages. While direct witnessing of the act was rare, though, as we've seen, guests sometimes waited just outside the bed curtains. Indirect proofs might include the public display of bloodied bedsheets the morning after, supposedly proving the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation, though this was easily faked and utterly unreliable, or sworn testimonies from attendants. The gory history is in this obsession with physical proof, reducing a deeply personal act to a matter of public, legalistic, and often voyeuristic scrutiny. The scholarly debate often considers the psychological impact of this intense pressure for consummation, particularly on very young brides who were often physically and emotionally unprepared. Even if actual consummation was delayed until they reached the canonical age of puberty, around 12 for girls, the knowledge that this expectation loomed, that their bodies were central to a political and legal contract, must have been a source of immense anxiety. For you, our medieval bride, the wedding night, and indeed the early years of your marriage, are overshadowed by this legal necessity. Your body is not your own. It is an instrument for forging alliances, securing inheritances, and producing legitimate heirs. The shocking secret is the cold, utilitarian view of human intimacy that this legal framework reveals. Love, affection, personal compatibility, these were, at best, secondary considerations, often entirely absent from the equation, especially in the marriages of the elite. The primary concern was the legal and dynastic function of the union, and that function, in the eyes of medieval law and society, was only truly fulfilled once the marriage had been physically consummated. This understanding adds another layer of horror to your experience as a medieval bride, where the most private of acts is imbued with the cold, hard weight of public law and political imperative. You have survived your child marriage, you have endured the public humiliation of the bedding ceremony, and perhaps, after years of waiting if you were wed as young as Isabella of Valois, or almost immediately if you were deemed of age like 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort, you find yourself pregnant. In a world obsessed with heirs, this should be a moment of triumph, a fulfillment of your primary wifely duty. But the shocking secret, the terrifying reality for any medieval woman, is that pregnancy and childbirth are not a gentle journey into motherhood, but, as your script notes from turn 267 so chillingly state, essentially playing Russian roulette with your life every single time. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was often a death sentence. Let's return to the harrowing story of Margaret Beaufort, mother of the Tudor dynasty. You are Margaret, barely a teenager, your body still that of a child. Your 24-year-old husband, Edmund Tudor, has made you pregnant within months of your marriage, at age 12. Then, tragedy strikes an already tragic situation. Edmund dies of plague while you are 7 months along, leaving you a pregnant 12-year-old widow in a politically unstable world. You are forced to make a dangerous winter journey to Pembroke Castle while heavily pregnant, an almost unthinkable ordeal for a girl of your age and condition. The human endurance required is staggering. Then on January 28, 1457, at Pembroke Castle, you, 13-year-old Margaret, go into labor. Imagine the scene, a cold, drafty castle room, perhaps attended by local midwives whose knowledge is a mixture of practical experience and ancient superstition. There are no sterile instruments, no antiseptics, no understanding of germ theory. Pain relief is minimal if any, perhaps some herbal concoctions, or just a leather strap to bite down on. Your confessor, Bishop John Fisher, who later documented the event, described it as a miracle that a baby could be born of so little a personage. This is polite medieval speak for, your body was so small, so underdeveloped that everyone, including probably you yourself, expected both you and your child to die. The birth itself, as your script notes emphasize, was so traumatic, so damaging to your 13-year-old frame, that despite marrying 2 more times after Edmund's death, you, Margaret Beaufort, never have another child. One horrific, near-fatal childbirth leaves the future matriarch of one of England's most famous dynasties sterile for life. This medical hardship, this permanent physical damage, is a shocking secret often glossed over in romanticized depictions of medieval queens and noblewomen. Her son, the future King Henry VII, survived, but at a terrible cost to his child mother. One quirky or rather grimly illustrative detail is that Margaret's experience, while particularly well documented due to her later status, was not unusual. It was the norm. The scholarly debate doesn't question if childbirth was dangerous, but how dangerous, and how this constant threat shaped women's lives, their psychology, and societal views on womanhood. The gory history of medieval obstetrics is a litany of prolonged, agonizing labors, infections, hemorrhages, and maternal death. For you, our medieval bride, the swelling of your belly with child is not just a sign of impending motherhood, but a terrifying countdown, a very real gamble where the odds are stacked heavily against your survival. The joy of new life is inextricably, terrifyingly bound to the ever-present specter of your own death. The traumatic childbirth endured by 13-year-old Margaret Beaufort, which left her permanently sterile, was, as we've noted, tragically common, not an isolated incident. The shocking secret of medieval marriage, particularly for women, is that the path to producing heirs, their primary societal function, was a path littered with almost unimaginable physical peril and a horrifyingly high probability of death. The statistics, even when estimated conservatively, are terrifying. Imagine yourself, a medieval woman, contemplating pregnancy. As your script notes from turn 267 starkly state, roughly 1 in 3 women died during childbirth or from complications shortly after. Let that sink in. 1 in 3. Every time you conceive, every time you prepare to give birth, you are facing odds worse than, as your script colorfully puts it, a modern-day base jumper. The human endurance is not just in surviving the birth itself, but in living with this constant, gnawing awareness of your own mortality, knowing that each pregnancy could very well be your last. This wasn't a hidden fear. It was an accepted, brutal reality of life. And the medical care available, if you can even call it that, often made things demonstrably worse. You are in labor, your body racked with pain, perhaps for days. The midwife attending you, likely an older woman from your village or town, possesses a store of traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Some of this knowledge might be genuinely helpful, understanding different birthing positions, offering comfort and support. But much of it is based on superstition, or worse, on harmful, outdated medical theories derived from ancient Greek texts that had been poorly understood or dogmatically applied for centuries. The gory history of medieval midwifery is filled with practices that would make a modern obstetrician scream. Your script notes highlight some of these horrors. Bloodletting during labor. Imagine this, you are already losing blood, your body under immense stress, and the treatment is to deliberately drain more blood from you, in the misguided belief that it will balance your humors or ease the delivery. It's a medical hardship born of profound ignorance. Then there are the birthing chairs, described in your script as essentially medieval torture devices designed to speed up delivery, often causing more harm than help. These chairs, often with a cutout seat, were intended to use gravity to aid birth, but if labor was obstructed, they could put immense, damaging pressure on the mother's body, leading to severe tearing, fistulas, or uterine prolapse, lifelong debilitating injuries if you even survived the birth. Wealthy women, as your script notes, weren't necessarily better off. Take Isabella of Aragon, Queen of France, who died giving birth at the age of 18, though some sources say 21, the youth is still stark, after days of agonizing labor. Despite having access to the best medical care available at the time, which likely consisted of prayers, perhaps some herbal remedies, some of which could be actively harmful, and the pronouncements of university-trained physicians whose theories were often no better than the midwife's superstitions, she suffered immensely before finally succumbing. One quirky detail is that physicians, being male, were often forbidden by modesty from directly examining a laboring woman, relying instead on the midwife's reports, further hampering any chance of effective intervention. The scholarly debate considers the true impact of these practices. Were midwives the ignorant figures often portrayed in later, male-dominated medical narratives, or did many possess valuable empirical skills, their contributions often erased or denigrated? Regardless, the shocking secret is the overwhelming powerlessness of medieval medicine in the face of childbirth complications. Infection, puerperal or childbed fever, hemorrhage, obstructed labor. These were common killers, and the tools to combat them simply did not exist. For you, our medieval wife, the birthing bed is not a place of serene motherhood, but a battlefield where your chances of survival are terrifyingly slim. You have, against terrifying odds, survived one childbirth, perhaps emerging scarred and weakened like young Margaret Beaufort, or perhaps, by some miracle, relatively unscathed for now. But if you are a noble woman, a queen, or the wife of any man of significant lineage and property in medieval Europe, your ordeal is far from over. The shocking secret is that your primary function, your most crucial wifely duty, is to be an air factory. You are expected, as your script notes from turn 267 starkly state, to get pregnant immediately and continuously until menopause or death, whichever came first. This relentless cycle of pregnancy and peril is a defining medical hardship of your existence. Imagine your life. You are married young, perhaps in your early teens. Your body, as your script notes point out, hadn't even finished developing. Yet from the moment your marriage is consummated, the pressure is on. Your husband, your family, his family, indeed the entire political or social structure around you demands heirs, preferably male heirs, to secure the family line, to inherit titles and estates, to forge future alliances. You are not seen as an individual with your own desires or physical limits. You are a vessel, a means to a dynastic end. The human endurance required to face this relentless biological imperative, year after year, pregnancy after pregnancy, is almost unimaginable to a modern mind. Your script notes cite the example of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and influential women of the High Middle Ages. She survived 10 pregnancies, each one a potential death sentence. And she was one of the fortunate ones, a woman of extraordinary constitution and perhaps access to slightly better, though still primitive care. Most noble women, your script continues, faced 8 to 15 pregnancies in their lifetime. It was baby after baby after baby, until their bodies simply couldn't take any more. You can picture these women, their bodies aged prematurely by the constant strain of pregnancy, childbirth, and lactation, their health often fragile, their lives a perpetual cycle of conception, gestation, agonizing delivery, and then, almost immediately, the expectation to begin again. And what if you failed in this primary duty? What if you couldn't conceive, or if you only produced daughters in a society that overwhelmingly valued male heirs? The gory history is that a medieval wife who couldn't produce the desired children, especially sons, was considered a failure. As your script notes, never mind that we now know male fertility issues cause about half of all conception problems. Medieval medicine blamed the woman for everything. You might be subjected to humiliating and often bizarre fertility treatments, or worse, you could be repudiated, divorced, if a suitable pretext could be found, often accusing you of some impediment, or simply set aside and ignored while your husband took mistresses in a desperate attempt to secure a legitimate or even illegitimate male heir. The psychological burden of being deemed a barren or failed wife in such a society would be immense. One quirky detail is the sheer obsession with lineage and the purity of bloodlines among the medieval aristocracy. This often led to consanguineous marriages, marriages between relatives, to keep property and power within a small circle of families, which, ironically, could further increase the risk of genetic disorders and infant mortality, adding to the pressure on women to produce healthy heirs against even greater odds. The scholarly debate considers the long-term impact of this relentless pressure for childbearing on women's health and status. Did it contribute to their shorter lifespans compared to men of similar class? How did it shape their lived experience and their perception of their own bodies? The shocking secret of the medieval noblewoman's life is that her womb was, in a very real sense, a battleground, a site of constant risk and societal expectation, where her own survival was often secondary to the dynastic imperative of producing the next generation, particularly the all-important male heir. So, you've survived your politically arranged child marriage, endured the public humiliation of the bedding ceremony, and somehow, against terrifying odds, made it through one or more life-threatening childbirths. Congratulations, our medieval wife. You might think the worst is over. But now, as your script notes from turn 267 chillingly introduce, comes the really fun part. Living with a spouse who has the legal right to beat, imprison, or even kill you, all perfectly within the law. Welcome to the shocking secret of reasonable chastisement, a legal doctrine that enshrined a husband's right to physically discipline his wife, turning medieval marriage, for many women, into a terrifying landscape of sanctioned domestic violence. Imagine your daily life. Medieval marriage laws, as your script states, weren't just unfair to women, they were downright terrifying. Under the widely accepted legal principle of reasonable chastisement, a concept with roots in Roman law and reinforced by later medieval legal commentators and custom, a husband was considered the head of the household with a God-given authority over his wife, children, and servants. This authority included the right and even the duty to correct their behavior through physical punishment if he deemed it necessary. The medical hardship here is not just the physical pain of beatings, but the constant psychological terror of living under the threat of such violence, often with no recourse or protection. What constituted reasonable chastisement? That, as your script notes, was defined very loosely. While some legal texts or social commentators might have suggested limitations, for example that a husband should not kill or permanently maim his wife, though even this was sometimes overlooked if her provocation was deemed severe enough, the reality on the ground was often far grimmer. Your script mentions the infamous rule of thumb, a later, 18th century but reflecting older attitudes, judicial comment suggesting a husband could beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. While the historical accuracy of this specific rule, being a formal legal standard in all medieval periods, is debated by scholars, it certainly captures the spirit of a society that largely condoned a husband's physical correction of his wife. There are documented medieval court cases where husbands were indeed legally cleared or received only minor admonishments for beating their wives for perceived offenses ranging from scolding or nagging to disobedience or suspected infidelity. The human endurance required of a medieval woman trapped in an abusive marriage was immense. Where could she turn for help? Her own family, having already disposed of her through marriage and received her dowry, might be reluctant to intervene, especially if it meant offending a powerful husband or his kin. The Church, while sometimes offering spiritual counsel, generally upheld the husband's authority within the marriage. Secular courts, as we've seen, were often presided over by men of the same class and mindset as the abusive husband. One quirky, or rather deeply disturbing aspect is how deeply ingrained these attitudes were. Even some medieval advice manuals for women counseled wives to patiently endure their husband's anger and chastisement as part of their wifely duty. The gory history of medieval domestic life is often hidden, unrecorded, but the legal framework that permitted such abuse is undeniable. The shocking secret is that the home, far from being a sanctuary, could be a place of terror for many medieval women, where their husbands wielded almost absolute power over their bodies and their lives. The concept of marital rape, for instance, did not exist in medieval law. A wife was considered her husband's property, her body his to command. This legal sanctioning of domestic violence, this reasonable chastisement, is a critical, horrifying component of why medieval marriage was, for so many, a living hell. Your survival depended not on the law's protection, but on the mercy or whim of your husband. You've now glimpsed the terrifying reality of reasonable chastisement, the medieval husband's legally sanctioned right to physically discipline his wife. But what happens when a husband, particularly a powerful one like a king, desires more than just correction? What if he wants to be rid of his wife entirely, perhaps because she has failed to produce a male heir, or because his eye has wandered to another? The shocking secret of medieval marriage law, as your script notes from turn 267 so vividly illustrate, is that it could be twisted and manipulated to achieve even the most extreme ends, including the legal disposal of an inconvenient spouse. And no historical figure exemplifies this brutal exploitation of marital law quite like King Henry VIII of England. Now, you might argue, as your script notes rightly point out, that Henry VIII lived at the very end of the medieval period and into the Renaissance. His actions, particularly his break with the Roman Catholic Church, certainly ushered in a new era. However, the legal and social framework surrounding marriage that he so ruthlessly exploited was still deeply rooted in medieval precedent and canon law. He didn't so much break medieval marriage law as use it, or rather abuse it, to its most horrifying and absolute conclusion. For his wives, this meant their lives were subject not just to his personal whim, but to his manipulation of a system already heavily weighted in favor of husbands. Consider the fate of Anne Boleyn, his second wife. You are Anne, a woman of intelligence, ambition, and for a time, the king's passionate desire. You have given him a daughter, Elizabeth, but not the longed-for male heir. As Henry's infatuation wanes and his eye turns to Jane Seymour, you suddenly find yourself an obstacle. Divorce, in the modern sense, is still largely impossible, controlled by the Pope whom Henry is in the process of defying. So a more permanent solution is sought. You are accused, as your script notes detail, of adultery with multiple men, including your own brother, incest, and treason. The gory history is that the evidence was practically non-existent, fabricated, coerced. But it didn't matter. The medical hardship here is the intense psychological torment of facing such monstrous false accusations, knowing your fate is sealed not by justice, but by the king's will. Under medieval and Tudor law, a wife's adultery, especially a queen's, was considered treason against the crown because it threatened the royal succession, and the penalty for treason, as you know, was death. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on May 19, 1536, after a trial that your script rightly calls essentially a legal lynching, and she was not the only one. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, met the same fate. When Henry discovered her premarital relationships and suspected postmarital adultery, he didn't hesitate to send her to the block as well. She was, as your script notes, probably around 19 when she was executed, barely older than a teenager. One quirky, or rather tragically repetitive detail is Henry's pattern: infatuation, marriage, demand for a male heir, disappointment, and then, for those who displeased him sufficiently or outlived their usefulness, ruthless disposal. The scholarly debate often centers on Henry's psychology. Was he a love-struck romantic-turned-monster, a paranoid tyrant, or a king obsessed with dynastic security above all else? The shocking secret is not just Henry's personal cruelty, but, as your script so powerfully argues, that this was medieval marriage law working exactly as designed, or at least as it could be made to work by someone with absolute power. The system was inherently designed to give husbands immense authority over their wives. While most medieval husbands did not have the power or inclination to execute their wives, the underlying legal and social principles that allowed Henry to do so, the wife's subordinate status, the emphasis on her obedience, the severe penalties for perceived female transgression, especially sexual, were deeply embedded in the medieval worldview. Henry VIII simply took these existing principles to their most extreme, most public, and most lethal conclusion. For his unfortunate queens, "Till death do us part" became a terrifyingly literal and often brutally expedited royal command. You've seen how a powerful husband like Henry VIII could use the legal system to dispose of wives who no longer pleased him. But for ordinary medieval women, and even for many noble women whose husbands lacked a king's absolute power to command execution, the shocking secret of medieval marriage was often a different kind of hell. The sheer, unyielding impossibility of escape from a bad, abusive, or simply unhappy union. Divorce, as you and I understand it, a legal dissolution of marriage allowing both parties to remarry, was, for all practical purposes, non-existent for the vast majority of people in medieval Christendom. You were quite simply trapped. Imagine yourself, a medieval wife, in a marriage that has become unbearable. Perhaps your husband is cruel, neglectful, or unfaithful. Perhaps you simply have no affection or compatibility. What are your options? Very, very few. The Catholic Church, as your script notes from turn 267 correctly state, controlled marriage, and they only granted annulments under very specific circumstances. An annulment was not a divorce. It was a declaration by the church that the marriage had never been valid in the first place, that it was null and void from the beginning. This was an incredibly high bar to meet. What were these very specific circumstances? You had to prove, as your script notes mention, the marriage was never valid in the first place, which usually meant proving it was never consummated. This requirement for proving non-consummation often led to deeply humiliating public examinations, particularly for women. You might be subjected to a physical inspection by a panel of midwives or matrons, or even physicians, to prove you were still a virgin or that your husband was impotent. The medical hardship and profound personal violation of such procedures, often conducted with little privacy or sensitivity, is difficult to overstate. Other grounds for annulment included being too closely related by blood, consanguinity, though the rules were complex and often manipulated by the powerful for political reasons, or if one party had taken a prior vow of celibacy or was already married to someone else. But even if you believed you had legitimate grounds for an annulment, the process could take years and cost a fortune, as your script highlights. It involved petitioning ecclesiastical courts, gathering evidence, often difficult to obtain, and navigating a complex, expensive legal bureaucracy. Most people simply couldn't afford it. So for the vast majority of medieval women and men, though the system was generally more lenient towards husbands, once you were married for life, however miserable that life might be. The human endurance required to live out decades in a loveless or abusive marriage with no hope of legal escape was a silent, unrecorded tragedy for countless individuals. Adding to this entrapment was the wife's almost complete lack of independent legal rights. As your script notes state, a married woman had no legal identity separate from her husband. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even testify in court without his permission. Under the legal doctrine of coverture in English common law and similar principles elsewhere, upon marriage, a woman's legal existence was subsumed into that of her husband. Any property she brought into the marriage, including her dowry, legally belonged to him. Any wages she earned were his. She was, in a very real legal sense, his possession. One quirky, or rather utterly patriarchal detail is that even a husband's debts could be passed on to his wife upon his death, but her property rarely passed to her with the same ease. The gory history of this legal subjugation meant that if your husband decided, as your script graphically puts it, to lock her away in a tower for the rest of her life, that was his legal right as her husband. While perhaps an extreme example for commoners, the principle of the husband's near absolute control was very real. The scholarly debate explores the extent to which social custom or community pressure might have sometimes mitigated the harshest aspects of these laws, but the legal framework itself was undeniably oppressive for women. The shocking secret of medieval marriage, therefore, was not just its potential for physical violence, but this profound, legally enshrined lack of freedom and agency for wives, a gilded or often iron cage from which there was rarely any escape but death. You are trapped in your medieval marriage, with divorce virtually impossible and your legal rights almost non-existent. Your husband holds immense power over you. But what if that power turns malevolent? What if he, for reasons of ambition, boredom, a desire for a new wife, or simple cruelty, decides he wants you gone? Not just separated, but removed permanently and perhaps even fatally? The shocking secret you now confront is that even without the absolute power of a king like Henry VIII to command an execution, a determined and unscrupulous medieval husband, particularly one of an elevated social standing, often had ways to legally, or quasi-legally, destroy an inconvenient wife. Imagine the fear. Your husband has tired of you, or he covets your inheritance. If you are an heiress whose property he controls but cannot fully alienate without your death, or he simply wishes to marry another, he cannot easily divorce you, so he might turn to darker, more insidious methods, often cloaked in the veneer of legal or moral righteousness. As your script notes from turn 267 chillingly suggest, accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or treason could be fabricated easily enough. These were the nuclear options in a husband's arsenal, charges that, if they stuck, almost invariably led to a wife's ruin and death. Witchcraft accusations were a particularly potent weapon, especially from the later medieval period into the early modern witch crazes. If you were an unpopular woman, perhaps old, eccentric, skilled in herbal remedies, making you a wise woman, but also potentially a witch. Or simply, if you had enemies, a witchcraft accusation could be devastating. Your husband, if he wished to be rid of you, could subtly, or not so subtly, encourage such rumors, provide evidence, a strangely behaving cow, a child falling ill after you looked at it, and let societal paranoia and the zeal of witch-finders do the rest. The medical hardship of enduring the tests for witchcraft, the pricking, the swimming, the sleep deprivation, was a form of torture in itself, often leading to false confessions. Adultery, as we saw with Anne Boleyn, was another devastating charge, especially for women of high status. While a husband's infidelities were often tolerated or even expected, a wife's adultery was a grave offense against property, lineage, and honor. It could lead to social ostracization, repudiation, confinement, perhaps in a nunnery against your will, and in some legal codes or for queens, even death. Fabricating evidence of adultery or maneuvering a wife into a compromising situation was not beyond the means of a determined husband. One quirky, or rather depressingly common, theme in medieval literature is the slandered wife, falsely accused and forced to endure terrible trials to prove her innocence. Treason, while usually associated with crimes against the king or state, could also, as seen with queens, be applied to accusations of adultery that threatened the succession. Even for non-royal women, if their alleged actions could somehow be construed as undermining their husband's authority or household in a way that impacted his feudal obligations or social standing, a charge with treasonous undertones might be concocted. The gory history is that medieval courts, as your script notes, weren't exactly concerned with due process when it came to inconvenient wives. A powerful husband or his influential allies could often sway a court, bribe witnesses, or ensure a predetermined outcome. The scholarly debate considers how often these extreme measures were actually employed. While perhaps not commonplace for every unhappy marriage, the threat of such accusations and the knowledge of the dire consequences would have been a powerful tool for husbands to maintain control and silence over their wives. The human endurance of medieval women lay not just in surviving childbirth and daily life, but in navigating these treacherous marital dynamics, often living in fear of a husband's displeasure and his power to destroy them with a word, a rumor, or a carefully fabricated charge. The shocking secret is that marriage, for some, was not a partnership, but a potential death trap where the law itself could become your husband's most lethal weapon. You've seen the legal and physical perils that often defined medieval marriage for women, but the shocking secret that underpinned many of these unions, the cold, hard foundation upon which these often tragic structures were built, was economics. As your script notes from turn 267 so brutally state, medieval marriage, especially among the property-owning classes, was often a business transaction where the merchandise happened to be human. And at the heart of this transaction was the dowry, a system that, while intended to provide for the bride, often became a source of immense financial pressure, legalized extortion, and a clear demonstration of a woman's status as an economic asset rather than an individual with her own agency. Imagine yourself as the father of a medieval daughter, or perhaps as the daughter herself. The dowry system dictated that upon marriage, the bride's family had to provide a substantial payment in cash, land, goods, or a combination thereof to the groom or his family. This wasn't, as your script notes clarify, modest gifts. For noble or wealthy merchant families, dowries could be enormous, equivalent to $500,000 in today's money, sometimes more. The negotiations for these dowries were often as complex and protracted as treaty negotiations between kingdoms. Your script mentions Isabella d'Este, a prominent Renaissance woman, whose family spent 3 years negotiating her marriage like a corporate merger, with multiple rounds of bidding. Why such enormous sums? The medical hardship here is the crushing economic burden placed upon the bride's family. They weren't just paying to get rid of their daughter, as your script provocatively suggests, though for families with many daughters and limited resources, it could certainly feel that way. They were, in a sense, purchasing a son-in-law's protection and status for their family line. A good marriage for a daughter, secured by a substantial dowry, could elevate the entire family's social standing, forge crucial political alliances, or provide access to new trade opportunities. Conversely, if you couldn't afford a decent dowry, your daughter faced a bleak future. She might either remain unmarried, which meant poverty and social death, or marry so far beneath her station that she'd drag the entire family down with her. The human endurance was that of entire families, struggling for generations to accumulate enough wealth to marry off their daughters, respectively. For the groom's family, the dowry was a calculated investment. They were acquiring not just a wife for their son and a future mother for their heirs, but also her dowry, which became the husband's legal property, her family's political connections, and any future inheritance she might receive. Marriage, as your script aptly states, was literally a business deal where the bride was both the product being sold and the payment being made. One quirky, or rather, deeply cynical detail is that if a marriage ended prematurely, due to death or annulment without consummation, there were often bitter legal battles over the return of the dowry, further highlighting its purely economic nature. The scholarly debate considers the impact of the dowry system on women's status. Did it empower them by giving them a form of property, even if controlled by their husbands? Or did it further commodify them, reducing their worth to a monetary sum? The evidence often points to the latter, especially as the dowry legally passed to the husband's control. The gory history is in the countless families who literally went into debt for generations to afford a single daughter's dowry, or who were forced to make disadvantageous matches that offered their daughters little security or happiness. The shocking secret of the dowry system is its pervasive, often ruinous influence, a constant financial pressure that shaped the lives, choices, and miseries of medieval families, reducing the sacred institution of marriage to a brutal economic calculus. The dowry has been negotiated, perhaps bankrupting your family in the process. Our medieval bride. The ceremonies, both public and private, are complete. You are now legally wed. But the shocking secret of your new status, a truth that underscores the profound medical hardship of being a woman in this era, is that you have essentially transitioned from being one man's property, your father's, to another's, your husband's. And in a twisted economic irony, the very dowry that was paid to secure your marriage, the price of your acquisition, now also legally belongs to your new master. As your script notes from turn 267 so starkly state, once she was married, everything she owned, including the dowry her family had bankrupted themselves to provide, legally belonged to her husband. This was a cornerstone of medieval property law, particularly under systems like English common law's doctrine of coverture. Your legal identity, your ability to own property independently, to enter into contracts, or to sue in court, was largely subsumed or covered by that of your husband. You were not an equal partner in the marriage. You were a dependent, a subordinate, a possession. You can almost hear the quirky legal justifications of the time, framing this as protection for the weaker sex, while in reality, it solidified male control over all familial and economic resources. Imagine the implications. Any lands you might have inherited in your own right before marriage now come under your husband's administration, and he is entitled to the income from them. Any movable goods, any money that formed part of your dowry, become his to manage and dispose of as he sees fit. You might have fine clothes, jewels, a comfortable chamber, but these are often at his pleasure, not yours by inalienable right. The human endurance required is to accept this profound lack of autonomy, this complete economic dependence, often coupled with the expectation of absolute obedience. And what happens if your husband dies? Does the property, including your original dowry, revert to you or your family? Not necessarily, and often not easily. As your script notes point out, medieval inheritance laws were designed to keep wealth concentrated in male hands. When a woman's husband died, she often lost everything. Widows frequently found themselves destitute because their husband's property went to his male relatives, not to her. While a widow might be entitled to a dower, typically a life interest in 1/3 of her deceased husband's lands, this was often difficult to claim, subject to legal challenges from his heirs, or insufficient for her support, especially if she had young children. This legal and economic vulnerability created, as your script describes, a vicious cycle where desperate widows would remarry quickly, not for love, but for survival. The gory history is one of women being passed from one husband to another, their security always precarious, their lives a constant struggle to maintain a foothold in a world controlled by male property rights. Some women, your script mentions, married 4 or 5 times, each time hoping the next husband wouldn't die and leave them penniless. Others, particularly if they were older or lacked a substantial new dowry potential, were forced to enter convents not out of religious calling but because it was the only way to avoid starvation. The scholarly debate explores regional variations and changes over time in these laws and customs. Were there some legal systems or specific local traditions that offered women slightly more protection or control over their property? Perhaps. But the overarching picture across much of medieval Europe was one of profound female economic and legal subordination within marriage. The shocking secret, as your script so powerfully concludes this section, is that the bride was both the product being sold and the payment being made. Her family paid a dowry to the groom's family for taking her, and then the dowry itself became the groom's property. It's a twisted transaction that perfectly encapsulates the commodification of women and the economic underpinnings of medieval marital misery. Your very being and your family's wealth are transferred from one male line of control to another. Your husband has died, perhaps from war, perhaps from plague, a medical hardship that was an ever-present terror, perhaps from a simple infection that a modern body would shrug off. You are now a medieval widow. While this might, in some rare instances, offer a sliver of newfound autonomy if you were fortunate enough to inherit property or control your own dowry, a quirky tidbit for exceptionally well-connected or legally savvy noblewomen, for most, widowhood was not a state of liberation but a precarious, terrifying descent into vulnerability. The shocking secret, as your script notes from turn 2 and 67 powerfully illustrate, is that remarriage, often swift and driven by stark necessity rather than affection, became a vicious cycle, a desperate scramble for survival in a world that had little place for an unsupported woman. Imagine your situation. Your primary protector and provider, however flawed or even abusive he might have been, is gone. If you have young children, your responsibility to them is immense, but your means to support them are suddenly drastically reduced. As we've discussed, inheritance laws were heavily skewed towards male heirs. Your husband's lands and titles might pass to his brother, his son from a previous marriage, if any, or another male relative, leaving you with only your dower rights, if you could even claim them effectively. Typically a life interest in 1/3 of his lands, insufficient to maintain your previous status or adequately provide for your children. The gory history is the cold, legalistic stripping away of your security. Desperate widows would remarry quickly, your script notes state, not for love, but for survival. This was the grim reality. An unmarried widow, especially one with children, was an easy target for exploitation, poverty, and violence. You needed a new male protector, a new head of household, simply to ensure a roof over your head and food on the table. The marriage market for widows, however, could be even more brutal than for first-time brides. Your value was often assessed differently. Did you bring lands from your dower? Were you still of childbearing age? A crucial factor, as producing more heirs for a new husband was often key. Were you seen as a burden or an asset? The human endurance here is that of women forced to make heartbreaking choices, to enter into new marriages with men they barely knew, perhaps men much older or younger, or men known for their cruelty, simply to secure a measure of physical and economic safety for themselves and their children. Love, compatibility, personal happiness. These were luxuries few medieval widows could afford to prioritize. Some women, as your script notes, married 4 or 5 times, each time hoping the next husband wouldn't die and leave them penniless. Each new marriage was another gamble, another potential descent into misery, or perhaps, if fate was unusually kind, a brief respite. The scholarly debate often explores the agency of widows in this remarriage market. While many were undoubtedly victims of circumstance, some shrewd and resilient widows, particularly those who had managed to retain control over some property, could navigate the system with a degree of skill, choosing husbands who might offer genuine partnership or at least a stable household. Your script notes mention Margaret Beaufort as an exception who became one of the richest women in England by carefully managing her inheritances and choosing her subsequent husbands strategically. But she was indeed an exception, a woman of extraordinary intellect, royal blood, and political connections. For most ordinary medieval widows, the choices were far more limited, far more desperate. The shocking secret is the societal pressure and the sheer lack of alternatives. If you didn't remarry and lacked independent wealth or a strong, supportive family who might themselves see you as a burden, your options were bleak: poverty, dependence on charity, which was often meager and humiliating, or, as your script notes, entering a convent, not out of religious calling, but because it was the only way to avoid starvation. This vicious cycle of death, widowhood, and desperate remarriage was a defining feature of medieval life for many women, a constant, grinding reminder of their precarious position in a patriarchal world, where survival itself was often the only achievable happily ever after. The marriage vows have been spoken, perhaps for the first, second, or even third time in your medieval life. You and your spouse have promised to remain together till death do us part. In our modern sensibilities, this phrase carries a weight of lifelong commitment, of growing old together through decades of shared experience. But the shocking secret, the grimly realistic context for this vow in the Middle Ages, as your script notes from turn 267 so starkly remind us, is that death was a far more frequent and an almost imminently expected visitor to most medieval marriages. Till death do us part was less a romantic ideal and more a brutally accurate and often surprisingly short timeline. Imagine the world you inhabit. There are no antibiotics to fight infection, no vaccines to prevent devastating diseases, no understanding of sanitation or germ theory. Minor injuries can become fatal. Childbirth, as we've seen, is a life-threatening ordeal for women. And then there are the larger societal medical hardships, recurrent plagues that sweep through communities, famines that weaken populations, and the constant attritional violence of warfare, feuds, and everyday accidents. In such an environment, living to a ripe old age is a rare achievement, not the norm. Your script notes state that the average medieval marriage lasted about 15 to 20 years, not because couples grew apart or fell out of love, but because one of them died. This is a sobering statistic. It means that the happily ever after so often depicted in romanticized tales of the period was, for most, a tragically truncated affair. You might marry in your late teens or early 20s if you weren't a child bride of the nobility, and by your 30s or early 40s, there was a very significant chance you would be a widow or widower or already dead yourself. The human endurance was in simply navigating this world where loss was a constant companion. Consider the impact of events like the Black Death, which, as your script mentions, swept through Europe in the 14th century and killed roughly 1/3 of the population. Imagine the sheer terror and devastation. You might be planning your daughter's elaborate dowry and political marriage alliance, your script speculates, only to have plague wipe out half the wedding party before the ceremony. Suddenly, all those careful dynastic calculations, those economic transactions, are rendered meaningless by the indiscriminate scythe of pestilence. Entire families could be wiped out, leaving orphaned children, widowed spouses, and a profound sense of societal chaos. Even without catastrophic plagues, the ordinary hazards of medieval life took a relentless toll. Men died in wars, in feuds, in hunting accidents, or from infections from minor wounds. Women died in childbirth at an appalling rate. Children died in infancy or early childhood from diseases we now consider trivial. One quirky, or rather profoundly somber, aspect of medieval life was the familiarity with death. It was not hidden away in hospitals or funeral homes. It was a public, frequent, and often deeply personal experience. Funerary rituals, prayers for the dead, and the memento mori, remember you must die, theme in art and literature all reflect this constant awareness of mortality. The scholarly debate considers how this high mortality rate affected emotional attachments and social structures. Did people in the Middle Ages love their spouses and children less intensely, knowing they might lose them at any moment? Most historians argue against this, suggesting that human emotions are constant, but that expressions of grief and the societal mechanisms for coping with loss were perhaps different. The shocking secret is the sheer, brutal pragmatism that this constant presence of death engendered, particularly concerning marriage. Till death do us part was not an abstract concept. It was an ever-looming statistical probability. And for many, that parting came far, far sooner than anyone would have wished. You live in a medieval world where death is not a distant abstraction, but an ever-present, almost intimate reality. Your marriage vow, till death do us part, as we've just explored, often translates into a partnership of tragically short duration. The shocking secret that follows from this high mortality rate, as your script notes from turn 267 so vividly illustrate, is the phenomenon of rapid and repeated remarriage. Medieval society, out of sheer demographic and economic necessity, adapted to this constant death by treating marriage, in many ways, like a revolving door. Grief was real, loss was profound, but survival for the individual and for the family unit often demanded that life and marriage go on with what seems to us an almost unseemly haste. Imagine yourself a medieval widow or widower. Your spouse has just died, perhaps from illness, accident, or childbirth. The emotional medical hardship of grief is undoubtedly immense, yet almost immediately, the practical pressures of survival begin to assert themselves. As a widow, your script notes, you might find yourself destitute, your husband's property passing to his male relatives. You have children to feed, a household to maintain, no independent legal or economic standing. Remarriage wasn't just common, your script states. It was essential for survival, and so, often, within months, sometimes weeks of their spouse's death, you would be back on the marriage market or being actively marketed by your family. This wasn't necessarily heartlessness. It was brutal pragmatism. You might become, as your script describes, one of those serial wives out of pure necessity, marrying multiple times, each union a gamble, a desperate attempt to secure a measure of stability before death reshuffled the deck once more. The human endurance required to navigate these repeated cycles of marriage, childbirth, if you were a woman, loss, and remarriage is almost impossible for us to fully comprehend. Each new spouse brought new dynamics, new alliances, new risks. For the wealthy, as your script points out, the pressures might be slightly different, but still present. Noble families would arrange backup marriages for their children, literally having contingency plans for when the first spouse died. This quirky, or rather, coldly strategic detail underscores how marriage was viewed as a crucial tool for maintaining power and property. If one alliance partner, your spouse, died, another must be found quickly to fill the void, to resecure the lineage or the political compact. Medieval marriage contracts, your script notes, sometimes included clauses about what would happen when, not if, one party died, a chilling testament to the accepted fragility of life and marital bonds. The scholarly debate often examines the social and emotional complexities of these remarriages. How did step-parents and stepchildren navigate these blended families, formed not out of love but out of loss and necessity? What were the property implications when a widow with dower rights remarried, or when a widower with children took a new, younger wife? The gory history is not always of physical violence, but of complex legal battles, family feuds, and the emotional turmoil of these constantly shifting households. Church records from the period, as your script notes, often read like a soap opera script, a dizzying chronicle of marriages, deaths, and remarriages. The shocking secret of this revolving door of medieval marriage is the profound psychological impact it must have had. Medieval people couldn't afford to get too attached to their spouses, your script argues, because the chances of losing them were so high. While historians debate the true depth of medieval emotional attachments, it's undeniable that the constant threat of loss must have shaped their experience of love, marriage, and family in ways that are difficult for us, with our modern life expectancies, to fully grasp. Marriage was indeed about survival and alliance, often because emotional connection in such a brutal world was simply too risky when death was always lurking around the corner. Our journey through the often terrifying landscape of medieval marriage is drawing to a close. You have peered into the secret horror of a system where children were sold young for political or economic gain, where wedding nights could be publicly bedded spectacles of humiliation, where childbirth was a statistical death sentence, and where spouses often held the legal power of life and death over one another. You've seen how economic pressures, like bankruptcy-inducing dowries and the ever-present specter of early mortality shaped unions that were more about brutal survival and dynastic strategy than romantic love. This, in essence, was the medieval marriage, hell, our title promised to unveil, a world where, till death do us part, was often a grimly short-term contract. The shocking secret is not that bad things happened in the Middle Ages. That is perhaps expected. It is the systemic nature of these hardships within the very institution of marriage, an institution we now associate with love, partnership, and personal fulfillment. You've understood that parents who sold their 6-year-old daughters weren't necessarily monsters, but cogs in a relentless machine of power and inheritance. You've seen how the church, while preaching sanctity, often enabled or was powerless against the political and economic forces that treated human beings, especially women and children, as commodities. The medical hardship was not just disease and dangerous childbirth, but the societal and legal structures that offered so little protection or recourse for the vulnerable. As your script so aptly concludes its main narrative, when medieval couples promised "till death do us part," they weren't being romantic, they were being realistic. Death was the only reliable way out of a medieval marriage, and it usually came calling much sooner than anyone hoped. This stark summary encapsulates the profound human endurance required simply to exist within such a system. Now, as the flickering candlelight of these medieval scenes begins to dim in your mind, as the echoes of forced vows and public bedding ceremonies fade into the quiet of your own modern surroundings, take a moment. Feel the comfort of your bed, the safety of your room, the profound freedom you possess to choose your own path, your own partner, or indeed, to choose no partner at all. The world you inhabit, for all its own complexities and challenges, is a universe away from the medieval marriage nightmare we have explored tonight. Let the gratitude for your present circumstances, for the progress humanity has made, however imperfectly, in recognizing individual autonomy and dignity within relationships, be a soothing balm. The stories are told, the horrors are past. There is no need to carry their weight with you into your rest. Allow yourself to release the tension, to let go of the unsettling images, and to embrace the peace that is rightfully yours. The gory history is now contained, a story for sleep, not for fear. May your dreams be untroubled, filled only with the gentle promise of a new day, free from the chains of a medieval past.